Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Levitsky. I'm director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. I'm jointly moderating the session with Maria Victoria Murillo, who is director of Columbia's Institute for Latin American Studies. Welcome, Vicky. This program today is a joint initiative of Harvard's DRCLAS and Columbia's ILAS. And thanks all for coming. As all of you know, Central America experienced an extraordinary process of democratization in the late 20th century, against the odds, against the predictions of nearly all existing social science theory. El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Guatemala put an end to decades of dictatorship and or civil war and established minimally democratic regimes in the 1980s and 1990s. That was an extraordinary achievement. Those achievements now are in serious peril. Nicaragua has collapsed into a dictatorship comparable, amazingly enough, to the Somoza dictatorship in the 1970s. Honduras suffered a military coup, a stolen election, and a decade of soft authoritarianism until an important opposition victory late last year. Guatemala continues to slide from crisis to crisis to crisis. And El Salvador, which was one of the world's great democratic success stories in the late 20th century, has descended very quickly into autocracy under President Bukele. Persistent inequality, weak states, and widespread criminal organization and violence have at times made it difficult to live, let alone sustain democracy in parts of Central America. So whatever one thinks about the democratic achievements of the last 4 decades, and I think they're actually pretty important, those achievements are very much at risk today. Today, we have the extraordinary good fortune to have 4 of the best analysts of Central American politics that I know of. Jennifer Avila from Honduras, Carlos Fernando Chamorro from Nicaragua, Oscar Martinez from El Salvador, Claudia Paz y Paz from Guatemala. Not only are these 4 really smart analysts of their country's politics, but they're at the forefront of the fight to defend democracy, to defend human rights, to defend press freedom in Central America today, in all 4 cases, at great personal risk. Before jumping into the session, I just want a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, we have interpretation, Spanish language interpretation, both ways. So if you need, this session is going to be in both English and Spanish. I think our 4 panelists will speak in Spanish. So if you need either English or Spanish translation, just hit the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Secondly, we'll be recording the session today. It'll be eventually available on DRCLAS's YouTube channel. Yes, DRCLAS has a YouTube channel. And finally, and importantly, if you have questions for our panelists, we want to hear them, but not through the chat function. The chat function is closed. So send your questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And you can feel free to submit your questions at any time during the panel. And Vicky and I will field questions and feed them to the panelists. So let me now pass the baton to Vicky, who will introduce our 4 panelists.
Gracias, Steve. Yo paso al castellano si prueban su interpretación.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to switch to Spanish. That way we can test if translation works. But this is a collaboration between DRCLAS and ILAS in Colombia, and also CEMECA, which is our new Center for Mexico and Central America. So it's a great pleasure for me to present these fellow Central Americans that really will talk about state democracy and everything that has to do with human rights and the defense of them. So for us, it's a pleasure to be here for our foreign, everyone here. And these are so important topics, we shouldn't stop talking about them. So for our Central American, we have Oscar Martinez, who is an editor of special investigations of the magazine and also the El Faro, which is a journalistic project begun in El Salvador, whose online component is the first Latin America internet newspaper. So we have Jennifer Avila, who is a journalist and founding editor-in-chief of Contra Corriente. Then Claudia Paz y Paz, Guatemala's first female attorney general, and is currently the secretary of multidimensional security at the Organization of American States. and she works for the Ezequiel program in Mesoamerica. And then we have Carlos Fernando Chamorro, a Nicaraguan independent investigative journalist. He's the founder and editor of Confidencial, a weekly publication combining investigative journalism and analysis of current affairs. So we have experts of the region. We thank you so much for your presence and time. So each of you will have 10 minutes. I'll let you know with signs, I'll wave my hands when it's, the time is over. So Oscar, the floor is yours. Thank you so much, everyone, and to the rest of my colleagues and panelists here. I feel so proud and honored to have been invited. Thank you for putting your eye in Central America. And I don't bring good news from El Salvador. So the detriment of the trifecta that has been building since '92 with the new peace agreements keep moving forward at an enormous speed. And there is no sign currently that would help us, say that the deterioration of the democracy is gonna stop. No, nothing signals that this will stop. We consider that we don't live in a democracy no longer. We live in a hybrid world, which has different, a lot of authoritarianism in it, but also a makeup of what's left of democracy. So let me just show you some of the important moments that really point out to the destruction of democracy in El Salvador. So Bukele, it's a political phenomenon with a lot of popular, more than 85% of popularity. Bukele has gotten complete power, something so basic in a democracy. May 1st last year, without following the rules or the guidelines that the Republic's Constitution say, the first gathering of his constitution called upon by him destituted the prosecutor, and they had an important investigation ongoing against the Bukele government because of corruption in the pandemic and, really affecting legislative professing. So also in the Supreme Justice Court, they named magistrates and judges that were allied to the regime and thus could be controlled. September 1st, always controlled by David Bukele, they destituted 30% of the judges, saying that those that had more than 60 years old were corrupt and thus had to be replaced by judges that again were completely aligned to his government and were elected by a council of legislative and different legal powers. So in September, the magazine where I work, El Faro, discovered an investigation with negotiations between this government and two big gangs that have 64,000 members in a very tiny country as El Salvador that only has 6.4 million inhabitants. So they had documents, government documents, and we actually showed how the government and the general direction had of the penal system had all these gangs allied. So September 5, the constitutional room, everything, they opened the path so that Bukele, for the first time, a president in El Salvador, could be re-elected immediately. He hasn't announced it yet, but he shouldn't even announce it because it's already there in the constitution. So the path is completely open for him to keep on being president until 2029. January 1st, sorry, just now, the Legislative Congress accepted, changes to the penal code so that agents that are covered digitally can be, and this is very serious because this happens only 1 month after we had an intervention in El Salvador against journalists. These were actions taken against politicians and journalists, and not only the new law reform for having access to public information. The Legislative Commission just gave permission so that this can go to the floor. And this was one of the great gestures of Salvadorian democracy, which is completely being destroyed, right? We won't have access to public information anymore. The counterweight of democracy, the criminalization of incidents, this is the policies that have been, highlighted during Bukele's presidency. He's quite popular. Why? Because he's a product of a country like this. He is a result of a country without democratic consolidation, a country without reconciliation processes, and with a population that is fed up with political class. And let me remind you that the last four presidents previously to him that were traditional right-winged are whether as refugees with Ortega's government, one of them accused of stealing millions of dollars. The other one is in prison because he stole more than $300 million. And the other one died in during a jury because he also had stolen money, that he actually stole money for disaster relief actions. So you can imagine. Now, the population is fed up with this political class. They are disenchanted and very little tools are at their hands to choose properly. So that's why he's so popular. Salvador is some sort of caudillo. There isn't a really path for a full state of democracy. So these types of conditions are seeking alternatives desperately. And that's why now I'm going to show you the panorama of journalism in the region. Now, what has happened with journalism? And let me talk about the magazine, because that way you'll know more in detail what happened. For more than 1 year, we've had illegitimate audits. They just took the journal for a couple years. We've had persecution. They've been following us. The intelligence area of the government have been following us with agents. David Bukele using public resources in a national TV chain, showing a photo of our founder, accused us of laundering money. And this is a process that is still in course. Spying is the last sign or trace of what we've been living for 3 months since the last time we've been in the scrutinium of the University of Toronto and Axel, or expert, organizations that detect this Israeli kind of technology that spies on governments, on people, so that's why we've been there. We are a journal that has more than 40 people working here. 22 members of this magazine had been tapped in by security and, undercover services. In the case of Carlos Dada, he was 167 days with his phone tapped in by this technology, Pegasus. And he was 269 days in some things that organizations think that is unprecedented. In my case, I'm chief of redaction, so I'm the one who covers more, stories. So I've been tapped in. They don't only know my journalistic activity, but they also perfectly know the people I love, the people I hang out with, and the people that I care about. So I am convinced that after an investment as such, the government or the state, and these are the organizations that, that purchase this type of systems, are the ones that want to hurt us journalists. So here's the dilemma I want to close my argument with. And this doesn't only apply to journalism, to civil society, to universities, that have been criminalized by the presidency. I mean, this is a moment where a society like El Salvador needs to have, citizen expressions. There haven't been any moments where the journalists in El Salvador, are mostly needed. Not like now. This is a moment where we need them the most. And, And there are some people in my journal that have been threatened. They've escaped the country. Some stay here, but they've been hurt. They've denounced it to the police, but nothing's happening. And there's judicial, current investigations ongoing in many cases. I have to close by saying that in El Faro, we won't quit. But, there's terrible dark cloud coming our way, we're facing terrible things. And sadly, I think, and I have every element in my hands to assure you that it's very difficult for this year to end without someone of us getting arrested. So that is a reality. And this is a situation that's happened in other countries, like I'm sure Carlos Fernando Chamorro is going to say later on, but I just want to leave that on the table so that you can think, no, please don't think that this is over. It's only begun. Thank you. Thank you so much for this very realistic and sad representation of what's happening. So now we'll give the floor to Jennifer. Hello, and yes, it's really sad to think that these are regional patterns, right? Because a lot of the things Juan Orlando Hernandez did them as well. And now, despite the fact that we have a new government with new hope, there's some characteristics that we're already seeing that I think are leading us to what you're saying, Oscar, with that new government. So yes, sadly, but true. Now, I just want to do a recount on everything that happened in Honduras in these last years with the coup d'etat. And really, this has been a very breaking point, because Honduras is a government that is like El Salvador, with a broken democracy after 12 years of autocracy, with Juan Orlando Hernandez at the head of it. So as you all said, Juan Orlando Hernandez has been he's been blamed by the US as conspirator for drug dealing in the Engel list, but also he was the leader of corruption networks that ended up looting the state and left us with a broken state, basically, in this transition for the government. And the 2009 coup destroyed the very weak basis of democracy that was starting to being built. And it did it through civil institutions, with military, having access to power, and together with what the world wouldn't see it as badly, not to lose international financing. They did it like that in order to survive, putting makeup on, like Oscar said. So as well as it was said in the 80s with the, coup that was revested with, like a screen, a democratic screen just to show off. But, we had, to build upon that. And after that moment of elections, after the coup d'etat with Orlando Hernandez and his party, they started to redesign the institutionality of the state. The high repression and high, were specific, in some cases they were brief, but they had a high impact on the population. The concentration on power, the benefits and prerogatives of armed forces and judiciary forces, so that corruption networks would attack the state, had a design, had conception behind what we could call democracy, quote unquote. And at least they were maintained in that direction. We could say that the first years post-coup weren't as conflictive. I mean, the government started to design autocracy, and Juan Orlando, that's where he consolidated, and it gave that criminal touch of facilitating not only for criminal networks, but also drug trading. And the biggest break that we had, it was the process of construction of autocracy, was the decision of Juan Orlando to be re-elected in 2017. In Honduras, citizens don't know what democracy is, and in their survival mode, many don't get involved with politics. Many of them don't accept this presidential re-election. Everyone is so scared of the eternal dictator, but every 4 years, political bigger parties, were the ones, the liberal and the national parties had to take turns to suck the life of the state. So the alternates on power talks about that, you know, because that's the way the democratic system should work for many. So maybe you don't, these are not the right reasons for a dictator to stay in power, but this is a polemic idea that for people, you know, that's why Juan Orlando Hernandez turned the country in his source of income for the state, and it turned it also into a desert for the middle class society that was very small, very poor, and also for the poorest population. He created institutions, new, fused some, and then legislated from the executive power. He put in power, you know, close circle people, even, you know, family members. The judicial power was taken by him. He created networks with criminals, but also business networks with an economical elite that has always seek to get richer and richer. He had imprescindible partners with different criminal networks at all levels. He used institutional paraphernalia, you know, to really sack institutions. It was a shell that wasn't working, you know, for what it was supposed to work, to give a service to the population, to assist the citizens and make them feel they were living a democracy, as I said, quote unquote. So this is something visible in Honduras, you know, it's this strong institutionality that permeates, you know, for getting resources, but it's so weak to solve citizens' real issues. So despite all efforts, you know, the National Party lost presidential elections, and they also lost more than 10 curules in the National Congress and the entirety of the power in the legislative power on top of losing the presidency. So people say that they voted for a change, right? But how real can a change be nowadays? Honduras doesn't have local wealth that is developed, and the previous autocratic power left the country completely indebted with so many millionaires, you know, taking the money away. And what we have, you know, a building built upon a swamp. That's what we got. The euphoria with the new government, you know, and that new euphoria hasn't passed. And that's dominating the first decision taking of this new government faced to the chaos of what it's receiving. So that's why we have a government that is led by Mara Castro. She's the wife of Manuel Rosaya, who was the president in 2009. And this government is born with an alliance with two parties that are ideologically different. You know, after the coup, they were called the left party, Partido de Izquierda y Partido Salvador de Honduras, who is born around the outsider figure of a TV host, you know, with a big enough ego to be, you know, to be named the savior of Honduras. So that's why they're, despite the population voted massively to give presidency to this alliance, in the National Congress elections, people didn't vote it as such. They voted differently, let's say. They created a national group gathering forces, and that is interesting, but it doesn't allow a single party to be concentrated in power and for all decisions to be taken there. But in Honduras, in a country where we don't understand about democracy, I mean, this isn't positive for the executive power and is an obstacle to have opposition, you know, because it doesn't give you the power of the three powers. As you know, the new government started, because a new session to see who was going to lead this national board didn't respond to the political pact that Xiomara Castro had done previously to choose their own president of the National Congress. So the party, said that people that they feared that alliance pact were traitors, so they victimized the elected, obviously, person in charge, and they named that they were asking citizens to take the Congress and to legitimate it as, to clean house. So someone said once in a panel that I was before that the first action of the new Congress was to say that of the Congress that supports the president, of course, to say that it was to open doors to people, let people in, so that they feel part of the hemiciclo, to feel that they are part of the government, as if that's what's institutionality to, for people to solve their issues, which is not. But that's why, they did it very specifically in the sense that this was a political crisis for parties, and it was, solved in a meeting. Ex-president Mr. Zelaya, without the president or without the presence of other parties, they did a pact with the dissidents of the Free Party. And that's how we see how Manuel Zelaya is using the presidential home to solve party issues, but also, now presidential. And also this government, definitely, they've been, really devastating their actions, because even with the Congress in conflict, a lot of deputies have elected, the Republic is like the Attorney General for the state. And this Attorney General had a lot of vices in the election. There was even a ruling that includes an amnesty for some crimes, some of them that have to do with corruption, for judicial cases. So in that case, they're protecting themselves. Now, on the other hand, we have the National Party, which is trying to see how can we make the most of each little crackling problem that's being generating around the creation of this new government. The Partido Nacional supports a national board that wanted to create a law for extradition. This obviously is quite delicate, right? To do an extradition treaty law, and we still don't know what that proposal of law said, right? We still don't know. So they wanted to approve that, and this crisped a country where the population is still waiting for the extradition of this ex-president, because he's a co-conspirator in all different crimes. So institutional processes in Honduras are so complex, and with a new government, that's what we've seen, how to comply with campaign promises for example, derogation of development or reforms to the penal code. But we need political action, people that have action to these parties that have impunity, because these are part of corrupt structures in the country. So this is a shadow that goes hand in hand with this beginning of presidency, and really and it supposedly has power in the legislative power, and it has past actions of centering, power to get to have this abolition. So it's important to have this, and the new government shouldn't exit. And I think that this is what we believe. Those that are surveilling closely what's happening. There's a lot of organizations, civil organizations, journalists, independent journalists like us, trying to show this, trying to shed light on this, right? So, and the new government says that we're fake news, you know the story, right? We're telling lies, this isn't real journalism, etc. So, etc. You know this story about how they're portraying us. But civil society and independent journalists have an important task of, our task is to surveil, right? To make sure that there's, a right balance of powers, democracy is being respected, that in a country such as ours, with citizens that really want to see a change happen, we have to make sure that they can succeed, because we have a country with a citizen base that is quite impoverished, and really they are looking to survive day by day, right? It's a survival mode here. So that's why we're living an interesting moment for the country, but also you know, we can't get blinded by hope. We can either get, you cannot do that either, get blinded by hope. Thank you so much for your presentation, Jennifer, about Honduras. And now let's listen to Claudia Pasipas about Guatemala. Hello, hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies for organizing this event this afternoon. And I really believe that for every Central American being summoned here, I think we're really deeply worried about the situation in the region, you know, authoritarianism, resurgence, Carlos Fernando is going to explain the Nicaraguan situation. And let me tell you, that's the most serious situation of them all. But as he'll probably say, Carlos, I mean, that is where we're all heading to, quickly and swiftly. Every single country like El Salvador, Guatemala, I mean, we're all heading there. I mean, although Honduras, as Jenny well said, they have enormous challenges ahead in order to strengthen, this democratic system. But right now, as of today, post-election, you had like a breath of fresh air, I think, in a way, Jenny. But the story of Guatemala is also built upon a very difficult, weak democracy basis, which, 10 years ago had impressive steps forward if we compare it with the rest of the region. We installed in the country the Comisión Internacional contra la Impunidad, the International Commission Against Impunity, had unprecedented results for the justice system to investigate criminal actions. We put ex-presidents, ex-ministers before the law, even signaling tax evasion for part of the head of part of elites, in the country. But unfortunately, this had a cost, an enormous cost attached to it, which was that these political elites, economical elites that really wanted, that had shared, this limitless power for years on end, felt that this status quo was threatened. So they allied, and this is what we call a pact for corruption and in favor of impunity. And since 2019, what we saw was a scaling up of a continuous movement towards the weakening of democracy, as Oscar well said, giving them full control and completely weakening every counterweight for the executive branch. Now, something similar that happened in Nicaragua. So the control of the executives, with the magistrates being named in Honduras. And when the Congress destituted magistrates for the Constitutional Court, and that is what we were hearing from Oscar. That also happened in El Salvador with the destitution of the general attorney and the and this is what we're seeing also in Guatemala. And that's why I'm linking that, because these are patterns that we're seeing in every single country. So how this is kind of contagious, this authoritarianism is contagious. In Guatemala, 27 months without renewing the high courts, the Supreme High Court of Justice. There was an election for constitutional power that was quite questioned, and the only independent judge, Gloria Porras, was impeached. She wasn't able to take her account. So that means that we observe also this, this cooptation, not only in Guatemala for the executive power, but for this pact. Let's say it's economic and political corrupt elites that gather and really break any type of control that it could be external.
También con muchísima preocupación.
We are very concerned because last year there was an arbitrary destitution of people from the Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. Juan Francisco Alfaro and Gloria Porras are in the US together with Aldana, the prosecutor that followed me. And this comes together with a very strong criminalization of those who are using the law. Ms. Porra had like 60 open processes against her. Francisco has an arbitrary arrest order, which is illegal. And this is a situation that independent judges have been facing as well. There are different cases against the judge Pablo Chicomul, who is fighting against human rights violations. He was fighting against people from the army and he had to quit yesterday. And there are processes against the judge Erika Ivan. And today, this morning, precisely this morning, we saw that a prosecutor from the Attorney General's office was arrested illegally. They just don't want investigations against corruption to progress. And her defender was arrested as well. This is a pattern that we're seeing in Nicaragua as well, with the arrest of political people. So this is a very serious situation. If we try to think, to imagine what could be done, I mean, we're talking about judges, prosecutors, human rights defenders, journalists, the ones that are being arrested, but they're trying to stop the erosion of the democratic system. But their freedom is affected, their lives, or they have had to leave the country. Nowadays, as the example I was telling you about, they are in jail. These two lawyers I was telling you about. So all actions to stop this weakening needs to go beyond. We need to have national actions to do so, but also international actions. We need to go against those doing these criminal acts. In a couple of weeks, we're going to have a new attorney general, and it seems that the country wants an attorney that follows the government to be appointed. But we need to go beyond. In our case, in Guatemala, economic elites are being benefited from corruption, and they have maintained and supported this controlled regime, this regime that's controlling democracy, and this is all for their own personal benefit. So this joint exchange of what's happening in our country should work to help us to plan common strategies, as I was telling you. We need to truly stop authoritarianism in the Central American region. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Common patterns are scary, we know that. And now we're going to pass the microphone to Carlos Chamorro. He's going to talk about maybe the most complicated case of all. Carlos, go ahead. Hello, greetings to my colleagues and to everyone in the audience. I want to thank the professors, Mr. Murillo, Mr. Levitsky, and Ms. Murillo for organizing this forum. For me, it's a great honor to be here sharing this table with Professor Karl. She enlightened us during the 90s. She talked about the hybrid regimes in Central America, and since then she has always been committed to fighting for justice and human rights in El Salvador and the entire region. I am a journalist and I'm used to ask to sources, to experts, So I usually don't provide answers to complex topics such as the one from this forum, the crisis of democracy. But let's talk about the case of Nicaragua. Let me say that it should be studied as the case of a transition towards democracy, but a democracy that failed since 1979 and 2006. Today, a dictatorship is being consolidated, a dictatorship that truly affected democracy and has been affecting it for the last 15 years. Since 2008, there is a totalitarian dictatorship. It's a long story that started in 1979 with the revolution against Somoza's dictatorship. And after generating democracy and social changes expectancies, it failed. When the economy was affected, there was an external war and a civil war that was fed with authoritarianism. In 1990, a new transition cycle started. There were 4 presidential elections and a political and economic transition process. New institutions and democratic institutions emerged, as well as shared values such as freedom of speech, freedom of journalism, accountability. We all thought that that was great. And also we saw the professionalization of the army and police forces. However, this second transition that lasted 16 years, managed by 3 different governments, mainly led by economic elites and an emerging civil society, could not achieve democracy and could not achieve what we needed. In 2007, Mr. Ortega won the presidency, and his party did not represent a second stage of the revolution as the official propaganda said, but the continuity of economic policies and market policies of the democratic transition. But Ortega was a Somoza. He focused all the powers of the state. There were violations to the constitution, fraud, the creation of his own family group. He was in charge of the army, of police forces, and he even got political support because of the economic cooperation from Venezuela and thanks to an alliance with important businessmen who gave economic stability to the country in exchange of democracy and transparency. This authoritarian model without opposition was called soft authoritarianism. And the ambassador of El Salvador in 2009 will be prosecuted and convicted together with other 7 political prisoners because of this alleged crime of conspiration. He described this as a responsible populism. In April 2018, a student strike started and it became a civic demonstration. Everyone was fighting for justice and for Ortega to leave the power. The model collapsed when the regime went against the strike. More than 300 people died. Thousands of people were injured. Hundreds of thousands went to the exile and hundreds of thousands went to jail. So we have been debating this lately. We ended up generating a 3rd historical opportunity to have a change in Nicaragua and a new democratic transition, not through guns as in 1979, but through civic resistance and the electoral life, a process that has been affected because of repression and failure of the national dialogue and with the imposition of the states in September 2018, which affected freedom of gathering and mobilization, freedom of press, freedom of expression, and the right to choose and being chosen. There are no electoral warranties. So the opposition of Nicaragua accepted to have elections on November 7, 2021. The result was a new wave of repression in these elections that Ortega could have never won. Between June and November of last year, he sent 46 people to jail, among them the 7 pre-candidates of the opposition, civic leaders, political leaders, and student leaders, peasant leaders, human rights defenders, among others. So these are political prisoners that we have been having since February 1st. They were in the prison before, but in El Chipote, since last week, they have been having secret trials and they end up in jail because of these alleged crimes of unloyalty, spreading fake news, money laundering, and conspiration. This afternoon, in a couple of minutes, Dora Maria Telles, who was a former Sandinista who is in jail, will be convicted. And she is a symbol of the left democratic wing in Nicaragua. In 3 months in Nicaragua, as I said, we had elections surveilled by the police and all candidates in jail. And the international press started publishing and the international community started paying attention. Thousands of journalists from all around the world wanted to go to Nicaragua, but they couldn't. So they covered the elections from Costa Rica, where thousands of people from Nicaragua are. So the news is not what will happen on November 7th, because we know the results. The news is what will happen 6 months later, 1 year later, or 2 years later. And that's the same question I ask myself, and honestly, I have no answer for you. Will we be able to consolidate the Ortega Murillo dictatorship in the middle of the crisis and international isolation with its repression model without freedoms, supported by a political group, supported by the army, the police forces, and will he have control of the state? Will he manage macroeconomy? Because unlike Venezuela and Cuba, is not in the hands of the government, but in the hands of private sectors. And then we're wondering if international pressure can modify the correlation that we have, if we can break the pillars of the regime, and if we can have a political reform and eventually call new elections without Ortega and without Murillo. Right now, the only answer to these questions is that there is no way out, at least not at the short term. And the perspective of political change can only be seen at a medium term. Therefore, we need an opposition and we need the civil society from Nicaragua and the international community. We all need to have a medium-term political strategy. In the elections of November 7th, there were no surprises in terms of the results, but there were 2 important confirmations. Ortega self-selected himself without competition with a high degree of abstentionism. The figure goes from 60 to 80% according to Urnas Abiertas organization. This was a protest from the new political majority without a party. People that cannot protest because we cannot gather and we cannot mobilize. On the other hand, there was a post-election survey that said that Ortega did not get 75% of the votes, but less than 27%. While the addition of votes of the other 5 parties, and as I was saying, the opposition was together, but it didn't go beyond 38%. So after 15 years in the country, there is no political support. It's just close to 20% of citizens who support him. But it's a political minority who highly depend on the state budget controlled by the government. And at the same time, the opposition is going through its worst moment. All their leaders are either in other countries or in jail. So it's very complicated for them to reorganize themselves in the country because the police force is very strong. I'm a journalist. I'm living in Costa Rica now. I would be in jail in Nicaragua because there I am a criminal for being a journalist. 100% Noticias, La Prensa, and other media are surveilled by the police. But even if we're far away, we're still being journalists and we're still reporting what's going on. In these political trials that are being carried out right now, the evidence to convict these people are not acts against the state or alleged violent actions as we had in 2018 or 19. Everything is based on interviews, opinions, or publications on social media or WhatsApp messages. So journalists have no independent sources to be quoted, and those who want to speak or report do it under the protection of their identity. They want to do it anonymously. So this is a symptom of terror and persecution in the country. This is affecting all leaderships, including civil society and the Catholic Church. The pillars of the regime are the Central American Bank for Public Investment and a tax policy that truly affects everyone. It doesn't only have 5 businessmen, important businessmen in jail, but it is threatening others. It's saying that 6 private universities will belong to the state, and that was announced this week. There are no perspectives for new private investments. But the Nicaraguan economy is not collapsing as Cuba and Venezuela. Last year, we had an economic reactivation and we had growth because of the external demand and the good prices in exported products. And of course, we have remittances. The leadership of the private sector today does not want to take the civic role again because they're afraid of repression. And the economy is forecasting a loss of dynamism. So this is a huge question. We don't know what might happen for the consolidation of the regime in the next years. In the international sphere, 25 governments of America said that the elections of Ortega were not valid, as well as 27 nations of the European Union. But the OAS does not have 24 votes to suspend Ortega and exercise political and economic pressure to truly affect and allow the country to recover its freedom. Ortega has reinforced his relationship with Russia, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, and now China. A relationship that has more political relevance than economic relevance, but with no doubt, it can resist more international sanctions, but it wouldn't be able to govern 1 month if the police forces wouldn't be operating. That's why when talking about the international community and the opposition, I mean, they need to increase pressure to release the 170 political prisoners and stop trials so that these people can recover their political rights. But on the other hand, there is a radicalization policy that has no intention of discussing or negotiating anything else but economic topics. They don't want to accept political negotiations with the opposition. So I think that a short-term solution is very complicated. If we don't have an internal crisis for Ortega and Murillo to leave so that we can negotiate the transition with others to come. The main challenge in the country is strengthening the democratic civil society, starting with the independent press and civil society organizations. Lastly, we need to highlight a regional dimension of Nicaragua's crisis for Central America, something that would require the democratic forces of the region to consider. First of all, Ortega's regime in the power and the international tolerance of some nations and governments such as Mexico and Argentina incentive these authoritarian governments in the Central American region. And second, the political crisis of Nicaragua already represents a very serious migration issue, not only for Costa Rica, where more than 120,000 people from Nicaragua have migrated in the last 3 years, but also for the USA, where last year in the border, 50,000 people from Nicaragua were stopped. This is an increase of 1,500% compared to the previous year. And migration, with no doubt, started increasing exponentially after this electoral joke from November 7th. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you very, very much. You give us a very sad landscape, but thanks, Steve. Thank you, Carlos, and I want to thank the four speakers. Now I want to introduce Terry. In order to do that, I'm going to speak in English because I want to be more clear. And I know there is simultaneous translation in both languages. However, my Spanish is so bad that it might cause a headache for everyone.
It is an enormous pleasure to welcome Terry Karl, Emeritus Professor of Political Science and Gildred Professor of Latin American Studies at Stanford University. As a political scientist, as all of you know, Professor Karl has made a mark in several areas. She's done pioneering work on oil states and the resource curse. Her seminal book, The Paradox of Plenty, continues to be widely read and cited a quarter of a century after its publication. Professor Karl was also a major figure in the early wave of democratization studies during the 1980s and early 1990s, the so-called transitions literature. That literature led to a fundamental rethinking of theories of democratization. And Professor Karl's 1990 article, Dilemmas of Democratization in Latin America, continues to be on many syllabi, including my own. Third, Professor Karl is a longstanding expert on Central America, particularly El Salvador. During the 1980s and early 1990s, she spoke and published widely on the peace processes of democratization and human rights across the region. I should note, Professor Karl was my undergraduate advisor during this period, and I quite honestly would not be doing what I'm doing today had it not been for her teaching and advising. But that's just part of what Terry Karl has done. Beyond her many contributions as a scholar, Professor Karl has for 40 years been a tireless advocate for human rights in Central America. She's provided expert testimony for the US Congress and Supreme Court. She has advised UN peace negotiators in El Salvador and Guatemala. She's accompanied US congressional delegations to Central America, given lectures at the US State Department and Defense Department. Professor Karl has also notably served as an expert witness in major human rights and war crimes trials in the United States that set important new legal precedents, most notably the first US jury verdict against Salvadoran military commanders for murder, torture, and crimes against humanity under the doctrine of command responsibility. Thanks in part to her work, Salvadoran generals José Guillermo Garcia and Carlos Eugenio Vides Casanova were held, at least partially accountable, for terrible human rights crimes and eventually deported back to El Salvador. Last April, a year ago, Professor Karl provided expert testimony in El Salvador in the trial for the 1981 massacre in El Mozote, which many of you know is one of the worst massacres in modern Latin American history, in which Salvadoran soldiers killed at least 800 civilians. So it is a great pleasure to have you with us, Terry. And speaking on behalf of DRCLAS and as a member of the Harvard Government Department, given our university's shameful treatment of you and numerous other women, not only in the early 1980s, but for 4 decades afterwards, it is really a special honor to have you with. Terry, the floor is yours.
Voy a decir algo en español primero. Yo tengo dos.
First off, I'm going to say something in Spanish. I have 2 roles in Central America, also in Colombia, other countries in Latin America. One as a Stanford academic, but also in trials. And I just want to say, starting right now, that what I'm about to say has nothing to do with the trials that are in progress right now. I'm not going to discuss them, but I am going to take questions for the trials that have already resumed. So the ongoing cases are not to be discussed, but for the Catholic Church and the UCA, for the murder of 6 priests, Jesuit priests, and the trial in Spain for them, and the 2 women that were with them. So what I'm about to say has nothing to do with the ongoing procedures and legal procedures that are ongoing. The second thing I want to say is that the coup against the impunity that happened the day after our witness in El Mozote was actually the day after. 5 days with experts talking about El Mozote, and In El Mozote, more than 1,000 people died, mostly children. And just to tell you that there is a link of impunity there. Now I'm going to switch to English because I'm sure that a lot of people don't speak Spanish and they're listening to these simultaneous translations. So I just want to say a couple things for the US, but also mostly for my years in Central America by using the words of the 4 people that really, told us about the dangers and the very difficult moment that Latin America and Central America are ongoing right now, and also the southern part of Mexico.
Here, what I'd like to say is a couple of things. I want to just tell you my principal points, and I'm going to add another one after listening to everybody. First of all, the most important point is to get out of the Cold War mentality that this is all about lefts and rights in Central America. It is not about lefts and rights. Nicaragua is a very tricky case, but so is every case in Central America. And I spent my time working not in El Salvador in Central America, but actually in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. And much of this could be seen quite early. So I think it's very important that we put all these cases together, that Central Americans begin to work together. And I want to really commend Vicky and Steve for putting this together and beginning to give us an opportunity to do what I think, and I will end with, needs to be done. I want to make 3 basic points besides forget left, right now. This is a story of decency versus indecency. And it is a story of crime versus no crime, as far as I'm concerned. So let me get to my first point, and then I'll talk about it in a minute. And that is that international intervention has consistently in Central America ignored the issues of crime and violence. There are reasons for that. That was except for Guatemala in a short period of time, speaking historically. So that's my first point. My second point is no, there were never democracies in Central America. And so I do disagree with you, Steve, in this case, because elections are not democracy. And I will come back to why I think that and why the institutions that might have produced a democracy were not there. Democracy is much more than elections. And Central America taught me that. I wrote a piece in, I think, the 1980s called Electoralism, which was the blind faith that policymakers had that elections equal democracy. The last point I want to make is the necessity to go both transnational and local. And so let me get to my first point first and try to go through this as quickly as possible. My first point is that civil wars, whether they were in Central America or everywhere else in the world, and peace settlements will never prosper in the face of pre-existing criminal networks and power structures. Now, what we knew in the Guatemalan, and I was involved in both the Guatemalan and Salvadoran peace agreements. The Guatemalan one benefited from coming a little bit later. What we know is if there are pre-existing criminalized power structures and networks and they are not dealt with, that this will create a source of impunity that will continue to the present. My second point, and this goes back to my work on, it's not really on natural resources, it was on rents, and rents are excess profits. It was never about oil. It was always about excess profits, which is the simple definition of rents. It doesn't matter whether the sources of illicit revenues are Bitcoin, petroleum, palm oil, the embezzlement of state assets, sorry, there's a mistake there, drug trafficking, human trafficking, trafficking of guns, or whatever you want to traffic, automobiles. All of those things are illicit revenues. And because they are illicit, they tend to have excess profits with them, some more than others, particularly drugs and petroleum. such criminal networks almost always have their first origins. This isn't their continuing origins, but their first origins in the security forces that were established by the United States, both historically and even contemporaneously. These rogue security forces, and I'm not talking about everybody, but it's always in the intelligence forces. I have never found any criminal network that didn't start with the intelligence forces and the security forces, at least in my work in Latin America. Historically and contemporaneously, they quickly develop alliances with other power structures. Now that could mean economic powers, it can mean political powers, and in the end, it means both. This is what are called criminal power structures. So they're not just the criminals themselves, but they're the ways the criminals relate to the power structures that are there. It's very important to understand that most criminals do not want to occupy the state. So it is more comfortable for criminals to have other people occupy the state than themselves. So that's something I just want to say. The other thing I want to say at the beginning, if you can see this, is that most people, and I'm talking to scholars now as well as policymakers in the United States, think that the most important countries are the big ones. That's how you get ahead professionally. If you work on a big country, if you work on Mexico, if you work on Argentina, you do not get ahead in academics or in policy if you get sent to Central America. That's not the way things work. What I want to show you now is a comparison I showed in a trial. This is comparative civilian deaths as a percentage of population. I had to use this in a Salvador trial, and disculpa, Claudia, I couldn't put Guatemala there, which is higher. Else, Honduras is lower, just so you know. I'll have to redo this. But what I wanted to show you is that Central America's violence is like something we have never seen in a contemporary period in Latin America. And for that reason, and because of its geographic proximity to the United States, it is absolutely essential that this is a major foreign policy issue, that this becomes a major academic issue as well. And I really want to commend Columbia and Harvard, and I would like to add my own university, Stanford, to these efforts. I'm showing you this picture that I took. This is in El Mozote. People who kill children who are 3 days old, these are murdered children, will go on to commit femicide, and they will go on to be criminals. This is very important to understand, so that any distinction between criminality that is, wait, I'm having a little trouble getting to the next one. Between different forms of criminality, whether it be the violation of human rights or illicit wealth, generally does not make a lot of sense, because the same groups will reconstitute themselves, often with new alliances. So you'll find, you know, when I went back to El Salvador right after the peace agreements, I saw a gang that was half FMLN and half Arena. They were young guys, right? This is what happens everywhere. So illicit wealth, whether it's corruption or it's any other form of rent, it creates incentives for politicians to capture the state. Why do you think Ortega wants to be there? You know, why do these people want to be there? And it means that those incentives come up in both the gray, what we call the gray economy. That means when you use legal resources like palm oil in Honduras, or oil in Honduras, or COVID masks in El Salvador. That's what's called the gray economy, to make illicit earnings. We call that corruption. And that could be anything from, as I say, the evasion of customs, non-enforcement or selective enforcement of regulations so that you favor one, you hit one periodista, but not the other. You I see Claudia's kind of smiling there, and that's because she knows that in Guatemala you hit one politician and not the other. That's what is part of the challenge, I believe, in Honduras today. So, you misappropriate, you do kickbacks, and very importantly, you do privatization. Because if you had not privatized the banks in El Salvador, they would not be one of the central, there would not likely be one of the central areas of money laundering today. There would have been more controls and more ability to do something. The Black economy is what we call trafficking in drugs, people, weapons, kidnapping, extortion, money laundering, threats to children, threats to women, femicide, etc. A lot of that has an economic motivation to it, and we must think of it that way. And what I do want to say again is that most people who are in the criminal economy do not have interest in taking over the state. It's just the politicians. And that's why you have such discouragement about politics. This has a long history of being the case in these countries. It is still the case. It was the case, in my view, within a couple of years of the peace agreements in the countries that I've looked at. I want to show you this because I'm not going to talk about this. Everybody sort of knows this story, but another problem is that peace agreements, not only do they not deal with the criminality and the informal groups that are there, but they also don't deal with, and not just peace agreements, by the way, but the transition from war to peace. They tended, especially those in the 90s, to develop economic networks that were never going to be able to address the needs of young people from 15 to 29, which is where you have your violence, where you have your gangs, in every country, by the way, where you have no opportunities or opportunities. And it is also why you have what I will show you, this kind of a picture. Now, that's the area we should be studying, if you asked me as an academic, as a Latin Americanist right now, not more than anything else. But if you look at this map, look at Venezuela, look at Colombia, look at Panama, Costa Rica, you can keep going. Costa Rica is now a transit point as well, by the way. I'm not going to talk about drug trafficking per se right now, but I can. And I want to say that was originally, in things that some of us did not want to believe, and I would include myself, that was originally a process that began very much with the US drug war against Colombia, the smashing of the cartels in Colombia. And if you think of water and smashing water with your fist, the droplets go just like those arrows. Those are long established, some of them shorter established. We could talk country by country because there's a lot of variation between countries. But when you hit a drug cartel, it turns into, that's what we've seen in Central America. I was particularly surprised when I was in a court case in Colombia to discover that a Salvadoran leader of the death squads had been in Colombia training the paramilitaries in Colombia, and they shared their ways of paying for all this stuff. And that was the beginning of all kinds of death squad paramilitary, informal security forces links. So even though this was treated as a war and military issue, it never, ever was just that. Ever. And I think that's very important. And now we have to start treating these as criminal power networks. Let me go there. So it's a historic, so that was my first point. I do want to say one thing about that before I get to the, this isn't final lessons, but oh yeah, excuse me. I do want to say one more thing about those criminal networks. This is not new. There were criminal gangs and networks at the end of World War II that were formed between the SS and American soldiers that had particular positions of power. So don't think this is a cultural issue in El Salvador. Don't think it's something only about El Salvador. I could go through every war that I have worked in every country that I've been in. I can tell you it was in Iraq. I saw it in Iraq. I saw it was around oil. Afghanistan, we can just keep going. Bosnia-Herzegovina, we can, and endlessly, these criminal networks mean that civil wars start often with ideology and different interests, and they always end up with criminal networks. The question is, can you stop those criminal networks from the very beginning? A peace agreement is a moment that is an opportunity. A second opportunity is a democratization process. Those are just opportunities, though. That's all they are. So, and I just wanted to show you this too. This is comparative violence in the Northern Triangle. This is new. You can just see how high this is and why people, of course, leave. My second lesson that I would like to partake, and this is just from long years of working in countries that had high rents or found rents or had criminality and were able to share their criminality. My second is that this was never democracy as I would define it. In 1991, Philippe Schmitter and I wrote What Democracy Is and Is Not. That is available anywhere on the web. What we really insisted on was that democracy was not a single institution and it was not elections alone. I had previous to that written the electoralism article. And what we said, it is fundamentally accountability and the institutions that create accountability. That means that all the institutions that, Claudia and Jennifer and Carlos have talked about in this, and Oscar, those institutions have been systematically ever not existing, or they existed and have been eroded. And I won't go through each country and all of that, but this is very important, that what modern democracy is a system of governance in which rulers are held accountable for their actions in the public realm by citizens. There are many ways to do that, of which elections is one, but anti-impunity is a very, very important part of that accountability. And if it is not, if you decide to build your country on an impunity agreement, you will have problems down the road. That's why I've always called these regimes in Central America hybrid regimes. I've never changed that, because that's what I think they are. So don't fall into a rhetorical trap of democracy. Say democratization. Say transitions from authoritarian rule don't always produce democracies. Or say the accountability and mechanisms of accountability, including the judicial system, including the press as the fourth of the state. Use these concepts of corruption and criminal political networks, which is what we're really talking about in El Salvador, in Central America. Not everyone. You don't need everyone. You usually need the president, by the way, but maybe not. Maybe you are not going to go to the president of El Salvador because you think she may be a very decent and honest person, but you'll find somebody in that network that will allow you to continue the criminal networks that you want to continue. Now that means that there are opportunities in Honduras in particular. I would say in Costa Rica too, because this trafficking is really becoming a major problem there. And I would say that El Salvador and Nicaragua should be treated as fully authoritarian regimes, whether they have elections or not. Why are we quibbling about the kind of repression that is going on in these countries in Central America? It doesn't mean that we are being I'm not being not nuanced when I say this, but why would we give certain kinds of labels to institutions that we're having a tremendous problem with, even instituting in the United States right now, as we know? Use accountability, use mechanisms of accountability. And then I think there's two things that I've learned in particular, some of this from Claudia Paz y Paz's work and some from my own field work all over. And that is, we must go transnational. I mean, the criminals are transnational. The people in Guatemala use the banks in El Salvador. They're transnational. Why are we not transnational? Those of us who want to build democracies, those of us who want to see peaceful societies to ourselves. I mean, we should be transnational too, in the way that they have always done that. That means our anti-impunity networks must be transnational. It means that Central Americans cannot think of themselves as Hondurans, Guatemalans, Nicaraguans anymore. I mean, of course you can. I don't mean that, but what I mean is that the links between all of us, between journalists, between scholars, between anti-impunity judicial forces, between procuradores and attorney generals and all of those kinds of people, we need to work together and find out what worked, because certain things did work in Guatemala. And we have a lesson there. Certain kinds of elections did work, but without an electoral Consejo Electoral, they don't work. Now, there's a reason why, if we don't do that, we are going to get into we are going to continue, pardon, not get into. My mentor, Albert Hirschman, who was both a major anti-Nazi fighter in his youth and also an incredible economist and scholar, he said there's three concepts. Just keep them in mind: exit, voice, and loyalty. What do we see in Central America today? First of all, we see voice. This is El Salvador the day I left, I believe. And we see voice. We see more voice, whether it is mass like this or whether it's in quiet localities. Now, that voice can be mass or it can be local. And it can, what you see in every place I've been in Central America is where networks are the densest, where civil society is the densest. And I'm not being a Pollyanna here. There are great variations. That's where you can find little islands of peace. And islands of peace can be constructed at the local level, but you need to know local conditions. And only Central Americans know those. External people do not. This is, I don't know why it's two, but this is this is migration from Central America from 60 to 2016. You can see what happens: violence, civil wars, not resolved, neoliberal economic models that cannot solve the needs of their own populations, and then eventually the choice for exit. Now, what are the lessons for the United States? It seems to me that the final lessons are really for policymakers, scholars, and activists. And that is, what we are experiencing in the United States is not an immigration problem. We don't have an immigration problem. We actually have a population problem because nobody is having children in the United States, just like other places. We have a foreign policy problem. And we've had a foreign policy problem in Central America since we started constructing the very kinds of security forces that are now part of the criminal networks. And that's what we have to understand, is that what we are experiencing in the United States in terms of migration, the border, the south of Mexico, et cetera, is blowback. It's called blowback, if you know these terms. And it's blowback because impunity begets impunity. If you do take your opportunities to do impunity pacts, which was the case in El Salvador, it has been the case for a lot of reasons. And if you do impunity pacts, all you're doing is pushing the problem down the road. That's all you're doing. If you do impunity pacts, it's like, as somebody said, rearranging chairs on the Titanic. I think that the United States has a huge political interest and moral obligation to deal with these issues of blowback. And I think that means we have to reconceptualize El Salvador, I keep saying El Salvador, reconceptualizing Central America in terms of criminal political networks that have links into the United States. It's not just Salvadorans or Guatemalans or Nicaraguans or Colombians or Venezuelans, but they have to sell their product inside the United States. We know that. I think that legitimate businesses are involved, and I would be interested in hearing certain questions I would have to Claudia about when you think as a prosecutor, you think you should prosecute everybody you can get evidence on. But the problem is that that's not how politicians work. They selectively prosecute. And the thing is that it gets very difficult to selectively prosecute when legitimate businesses are involved that cooperate with the kind of criminal activity I'm talking about. So that's a muddy area. But I really think that until we start pushing from below in terms of creating islands of peace, and that can be done in certain areas, and from above in a transnationalized way that gives support to a new president who really wants to change things in a way that is not authoritarian, that gives support. That means hybrid judicial systems, judicial mechanisms as well. We should involve other Latin American countries. We should involve the United Nations. It should not have left in 2019, in my view, in Guatemala. These are things that we have to do now because the people on the ground in Central America are in great danger. Those people who are like the people we've heard from today and who I admire to my very depth and who have been on the ground doing these fights. They're journalists, they're middle class, they're demonstrators, they're activists, they could be professors, they could be scholars, you name them. They are in great danger. And that means local and transnational. And that is the job, I believe, of foreign policy in the United States, as well as people on the ground in Central America. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. That was a great presentation. I have been reading, both Steve and I have been reading at the questions del Q&A. Voy a empezar, paso de nuevo al castellano. Voy a empezar.
Let me go back to Spanish and let me start with a couple of questions. Oscar Martinez had to leave because he had a health emergency. So I am not going to ask him those questions. A question we have from Sarah Maskin that was already part of Terry's presentation is related to the type of transition. If the way in which the transition happened or the democratic process, as Terry called it, processed in the 4 countries was not the one that allowed us to have transitional justice processes that were strong enough, or what could have been done differently from what happened in that transition process to avoid reaching the current situation. There are successful cases as the one from Guatemala, but that success ended up being eliminated, so it wasn't that successful at all. So maybe going back to the 3 speakers, what could have been done differently in your countries not to reach the current situation? That's the first question. And then there's another one that many people asked in the Q&A. Therefore, it's an important question. And Terry spoke about that too. It has to do with the role of the USA, both the role that the USA had related to the current situation. Everything from civil wars that happened all around the region, as we're seeing now. So what could the USA do now? The incentive of migration is big, yes, but there's people asking if TPS would be a good option. Some people are asking if sanctions would be a good option. There are different questions in the Q&A related. But specifically, what role can the USA play? Well, what role it played and what role should it play now? So let me go back to Jennifer, Claudia, Carlos. If you agree, let's do it in that order because Oscar left. Well, talking about transitions, although I think that Terry gave an amazing presentation about it, I believe that this is very related to the role that the USA played in the history of these countries. In the case of Honduras, for example, we did not have a civil war, not an official one, but Honduras became a counterinsurgent country. The USA played an important role that changed what happened in the future years and the construction process. As Terry said, we never had a consolidated democracy. And then the role of the USA with the coup d'etat and in Juan Orlando Hernandez re-election process. It is a very important role related to this crisis. The fact that Juan Orlando Hernandez, who has an extradition order, I mean, he was a strategic ally of the USA, and he's still operating this corruption and narco traffic structure. So that definitely affected greatly. It affected because Honduras stayed in the same situation for 12 years. So we're very dependent on the USA. And this might sound very colonialist, but we are very dependent on the role of the US and on the way it plays with other countries. We know that we have the migration agenda, the drugs agenda, and they all shape what we're going through in our countries. There was one question that you summarized, and it was, what can the US do for the democracy to be built now with this opportunity that we have with Castro's government? I think we need to learn from mistakes. The mistake of how to do an anti-corruption and anti-impunity mission. There were many errors from the beginning. We always depended on corrupt players for this mission to work or not to work. We obviously have an economic issue. We cannot have an independent justice system if we have no budget. And the international community plays a very important role as well. Attacking corruption transnational networks, we know that's important. I mean, sanctions are important, yes, but sanctions to these corrupt players in the US, I guess, are important so that they know that their justice is being made and so that they know that they're being accountable. So I think we cannot deconstruct minimum democratic processes. We need cooperation. We cannot do it by ourselves. And we do need the will of those strategic partners, such as the USA in this case. Claudia? Yes, Vicky, thank you. I think that this is the question that keeps us awake at night. What could have been done that we didn't do? I think that the peace process in Guatemala brought a deep change. We went from being a country in war to being a country in a democratic transition. However, I think that the power did not change. And these powers are the ones affecting all the reforms that we were able to achieve, mainly the economic elites, as I was presenting before, those players that get benefited from corruption. And Terry mentioned this very clearly in her presentation, those that have been benefited from money laundering, smuggling, drug smuggling, etc. Those lines that we saw on the Central American maps leave some illegal money coming from killings as well, from guns as well. So I think that we couldn't have a full transformation in Guatemala after the peace agreements. It was an unfinished process, let's say. I think that what we saw with the presence of Cecilia in Guatemala, the strengthening on the Attorney General's office, the strengthening of different tax control institutions to make those who earn the most to pay the most. That was something new in the country, and we were moving towards the right direction. That was going to strengthen democratic institutions and the entire system. What else could we have done? Well, Vicky, I think legal justice, because there was transitional justice and there's still transitional justice, convictions because of forced disappearances, because of genocide, because of sexual slavery during the war, but convictions in very serious cases related to corruption, no. So the legal law was not enough. In Honduras, they had a similar commission, so that could be important, but what we have done is not enough. First, we need to change the electoral system. We need to strengthen other systems within all kinds of institutions, the same political party system. In Guatemala, we cannot say that we have political parties. We have people using electoral shells, as we say. So we are moving forward, but we didn't do exactly what we had, and we didn't close the gap that we had because of the lack of legal justice. And this is connected to the second question. What's the role of the USA? In the case of Guatemala, the role of the USA was key. Their support was key for the establishment of CICIG, for the establishment of the prosecutor's office, for learning investigation techniques, for capturing drug dealers. We did this together with the Justice Department. But when the government changed, things became very bad for us. It was terrible to see how we had Juan Orlando Hernandez, the president, President Morales in other countries, in El Salvador. I mean, why did they prioritize migration? We cannot see migration as an issue. The issue is on our end. So while the US is still focusing on migration, it will have to be related to mean actors benefited from corruption that are against the democratic process, etc. The establishment of our three countries was an insult. We saw the killing figures. Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras were declared as safe countries to receive migrants from neighboring countries. So that policy truly affected us, and it ended up eliminating the progress we had in the North Triangle to progress in this democratic process. And I think, and let me finish by saying this, we have learned many important things related to the efforts that the US can do in the region. One very important thing is that hopefully these efforts have more backup, even within the USA, for things to be as sustainable as possible. And a change of government should not weaken this or take this back. We need to look at everyone involved. Of course, the most visible ones, of course, the ones who are part of drug dealing organizations, such as in Honduras, the brother of the president and the president himself, well, former president, sorry. But we also need to see who is behind and who is being benefited from these corrupt regimes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Claudia. Carlos? It's hard to answer this question, so I will try to enlist some topics. As Claudia was saying, this keeps us awake at night. I have wondered many times when Nicaragua changed, and then I realized we're worse than the day before. So in Nicaragua, there was no peace agreement and there was no commission for the truth. At the end of the day, in 1990, we had an election. If we talk about this last transition, and from then on, there was a political negotiation, an elite negotiation. I think there is an issue when talking about dismantling the Sandinista state. And there was an issue when designing democratic institutions. These institutions were born in a wrong way. Many things were sacrificed to promote democracy, and that ended up generating a huge social gap. There was migration at the beginnings of the 90s, not because of political issues, not because of persecution, but because of an economic crisis. And there was a failure. Well, the state was captured, let's say, by the economic elites, those who designed the economic policies and the state policies for 15 years. The institutions that were designed and many of the laws, even the laws during the transition in Nicaragua, laws for justice, for the army, for the police forces, were well designed. The problem is also related to the individuals. The issue is not the law itself, but the captain or the army or people themselves. I mean, Ortega told one person to stay in his position, so he stayed. So that's the issue, not the law itself, but people. And there is also a deficit when creating political parties. The political elites were not capable, and those movements born from below were not able to do things. I mean, there was an agreement between Arnoldo Alemán and Ortega. But anyway, I just want to say that in my opinion, there is no reason for which the failure of the democratic transition ended up in a dictatorship as the one we have today. This is happening like this because Ortega said he was against it. Because there's one mafia that kidnaps the power from below, and once they're in the power, they consolidate and they create alliances with economic elite, other groups, etc. Talking about the USA, honestly, this is a question I have for the future. I do not see an immediate exit in my country, although I know that long term there might be one. I'm thinking about the reconstruction of Nicaragua. We're going to need something similar to CICIG, but maybe with a higher scope to face corruption issues, impunity issues, human rights issues, and justice issues. How can that happen when there's no state? There's one mafia, not one state. We truly need to have backup from the international community. We need to have a government with a large political majority to do that. And I don't know if that can happen, if we can respond before those demands. So I think the US, in the specific case of Nicaragua, should keep promoting actions and multilateral initiatives with Latin America, with Europe, and not acting in a one-way manner as the Trump's administration did, full of noise, but with low effectiveness. It didn't truly support a democratic change. I mean, which should be the idea. And that was another error from the North American administration during the democratic transition in Nicaragua before Ortega came back to power. Thank you very much, Carlos. Terry? First, I would like to say,
we have a foreign policy problem again, and it comes straight out of what Carlos Chamorro and Jennifer and Claudia all said, which is that when there is a transition from authoritarian rule to democratic rule, there are only certain institutions in the United States or certain organisms in the United States that are involved in that transition. And I want to be very clear, I am not criticizing the peace agreements for what was left on the table. What I am saying is that unless you continue, for example, unless you continue to fight an impunity agreement, unless you take it off the table, you never draw a line in the sand between authoritarian rule and a real, not a real, I hate that word, and a transition to the construction of the kinds of institutions that Steve and Vicky and others have written about in other countries. So what I want to say, first of all, is that I'm not sharing the criticisms of the peace agreements that you see in Latin America, in Central America today. What I am saying is that right away, the United States should have said, when Arena put in an impunity agreement, which was an amnesty, they should have said right away, no, we're not doing that. And so should the United Nations. They should have said that, no, this is a crime against humanity. We can show it. And certain people have to be held accountable for that, because accountability, again, is the centerpiece of any really representative government. So that's the first thing I want to say. I want to just distinguish between that. The second thing I want to say is Jennifer said something very important, which is that Honduras didn't have what I call a war transition, which is a transition from war to peace, and then supposedly from authoritarian rule to democracy, and they happen simultaneously. That's what I call a war transition. Honduras had a different situation, but it is no accident that San Pedro Sula and that whole area is the origin of everything that has spread the criminality through Honduras. Not that there wasn't any before, but the much greater criminality through Honduras and into Nicaragua in particular. So that's because that's where the US base was. That's where all the counterinsurgency was. That's where all the training was for the kinds of security forces. Now, I'm not trying to say that the United States is responsible for this, but it has a responsibility, which is why I am saying this is a foreign policy problem, but it is not a reconstruction problem that you go in and say, we're going to give money. Because if there are no institutions, you cannot give money well. You can only give money to build the criminal political networks that are already there. And the other thing I just want to clarify is the networks that were there they were there in, at least in certain countries that I know very well, they were there during the wars of the civil wars. But they were there after the civil wars, and they have always continued. Now, they may have reshaped themselves into different groups, but they have never stopped. And not only have they never stopped, they have become more transnationalized, more links between Central American countries in criminality, more cooperative, more links with the Venezuelans, more links with the Colombians. I can see this because I've worked in both those countries, and I know some of the people that I see in Central America. Why in my last trip in Central America did I see Chinese, Saudi Arabians, Venezuelans? Why? Why are they there? What is in Central America that is so valuable? Not oil, not diamonds, what is it? What are those networks? And how do we then begin to treat that as a transnational foreign policy issue that has gotten far greater today than it was during the peace agreements? That's my point. In order to do that, the key thing I want to say is in the United States, you cannot just have the war to peace people or the State Department's democratization efforts. You must have the FBI, you must have police, you must have people that really know how to follow laundered money, how to follow criminal networks, how to follow the links between criminal networks and politicians. So if I were designing policy in Honduras today, I would be sending all these people to help the president, because this is an opportunity. this is one of the few opportunities that is there right now. And I would be saying, okay, we're going to do everything we can, and then we're going to see how we can not only unite our organizations working for Central America, but also Central American countries collaborating with each other and with the president of Honduras to say, no, we don't want our banks to be used this way. So that's the point I'm trying to make. It has changed, and it's changed in a devastating way.
Thank you, Terry. We have a lot of other questions. I have a lot of other questions, but unfortunately we are out of time, so I need to close. Let me first thank Karl and Mao and Lore and Jill for making this possible. You guys are amazing as always. Many, many thanks to Jennifer Avila and Carlos Fernando Chamorro, Oscar Martinez, who unfortunately had to leave early, Claudia Paz y Paz, for taking the time. And we wish you wholeheartedly the best of luck going forward, and really, really value the work that each of you do. And finally, many thanks to Terry Karl for taking time to share your wealth of insights. We really appreciate having you here. So stay well, everybody. Thanks for attending. Vicky, do you have any final words?
No, I just want to thank the panelists for giving us your time in this very, very important matter at a time that is urgent, and the audience to hear and to continue paying attention to what's happening in Central America. We believe is very important. I also invite everyone to follow. We're really following the region in our new Center of the Study of Mexico and Central America. So I really want to thank everyone for coming.